Okay. Well, my intent is to leave the summary of the course, the sort of description of the one far-off divine event towards which the whole creation has been moving, until after the break, probably a later break today, because there's one last chunk of substantive material that I want to go over beforehand. And this is finishing up the discussion of subsentential structure. So we saw last time, and the time before, that we should understand subsentential structure, semantically significant subsentential structure, as consisting of features of sentential sign designs rather than necessarily parts of them. And we saw that even if you have parts, even if you have singular terms that are physically part of the sentential sign designs, and simple predicates that are physically parts of the sentential sign designs, that the complex predicates, the ones that matter for the goodness of inference, the ones that involve the cross-reference patterns between the different terms they apply to, those are still going to be features rather than parts. And by features, I suggested we could think of patterns in terms of relations between the sentential sign designs. And the overall methodology for discerning those features is what I called the Bolzano-Frege-Quine method of noting semantic invariance under substitution. And we saw in meeting 10 how to use that substitutional method to discern the occurrence of singular terms and predicates, in particular the complex predicates. And then last time we considered a possible functional characterization of that sort of substitutional scalpel. What do you mean by saying two sentential sign designs should be understood as substitutional variants of each other? So we tried a top-down account of that. I want to go in an orthogonal direction today and consider the presuppositions of using substitutional relations among sentences to identify semantically significant subsentential features. I mean, we saw in our original discussion that there's two sorts of primitive expression kinds with respect to substitutional relations. There's what's substituted in the sentential sign designs, and then there's something that's substituted for. And the key observation that I want to start with is that both the sentences and the terms, in the classic way of doing it without worrying about the functional decomposition I was fussing with last time, you have to construe what's substituted in and what's substituted for as repeatable expression kinds in order for it to be intelligible that they underwrite substitution. That is, you have to be able to identify the same substituted in sentential sign design as having different substituted for singular terms in it, and you have to be able to identify the same substituted for term as occurring in different sentential contexts. So you have the same substituted for if you're thinking about substitution, I'll say implications, though it goes, same thing goes through for incompatibilities. But suppose we have PA turnstile QA, Thera walks, so Thera moves. Well, that depends on your being able to recognize Thera as involved in both of those. P of A, therefore Q of A. Or you have the same substituted in with different substituted fors. P of A, therefore P of B. Benjamin Franklin was the first Postmaster General, so the inventor of bifocals was the first Postmaster General. Again, you've got to be able to recognize those sentential contexts. And, we typically do that with expression types. But as we'll see, that isn't the only way it can be done. And so there's a question as to what that job is. What are we talking about when we talk about the repeatability of those expression kinds, even in the case where the singular terms are literally parts of the sentential sign designs. And I might just mention in sort of as an aside, a sociological observation about, I don't know, the state of philosophical investigation of this topic. There has been a lot of work on substitution, mostly by logicians. It was a discovery and something of a scandal in the 1920s to realize that in Principia Mathematica, Russell and Whitehead had not gotten their substitution rules properly. They didn't know how to formulate them properly. It was worrying about how to do that led to some of the important results in the 30s. But philosophers haven't much worried about substitution. I think of von Frosten in that essay we looked at as sort of wearing both of his hats in there, and he's an exception. But that restriction, it being the logicians who looked at it, the languages that they work with don't have token reflexive expressions in them. They don't have demonstratives, they don't have indexicals in them. They don't have expressions, in other words, where the distinction between tokens and types matters semantically. All the co-typical tokenings have the same referent. So they haven't worried about the sorts of issues that come up if we extend the notion of substitution to languages that do have those other expressions. Philosophers have worried about the issues that I'm going to address, but they've come at them from different directions. So at the end of my story, I'll talk about Kripke and his causal theory of names in naming a necessity as actually talking about one of the issues that I'll be addressing, but the direction he's coming from is purely semantic and metaphysical, whereas I'm interested in the connection between what you can say in those kinds of metavocabulary and what you can say in the kind of pragmatic metavocabulary that you have to use, I think, in order to talk about token reflexive expressions. Okay, so, if we say, suppose we make explicit, logically explicit, the license of what I'm calling a substitution implication. That's an implication that has a single premise, a single conclusion, and the conclusion is a substitutional variant of the premise. That's what we've been working with. I say P of A, we want to get to P of B, so we say, well, A equals B. But now we've got two tokens of the type A, the one in P of A and the one in A equals B. We've got two tokens of the type B, the one in P of B and the one in A equals B. And we've got to connect those. If those aren't, in some relevant sense, repetitions of each other or aren't the same, then that inference isn't going to go through. And that difficulty just isn't helped by putting the identity there, though if you think about the job that's doing, drill down in the way that I intend to do next, you'll see that denying self-identity, if we write A does not equal A, now the intelligibility of that statement turns on just how you understand the relation between those two tokenings of A. Is it the case that you have built into the rules for your notation a denial of, the denial of self-identity? Is that a metaphysical principle that you built in, or is that metaphysical principle a reflection of your rules for using your symbols? There's a funny sort of anecdote in this connection. The mid-19th century German logician Schröder was in the full flurry of the concern with greater rigor in mathematics and in logic, and he included as an axiom in his logic, his fifth axiom in his logic was, whenever I write a symbol A, it's to mean the same thing in all of its occurrences. And he saw the failure to say that as a failure of rigor. After all, if you hadn't stipulated that explicitly, that's what their notion of rigor was. Say explicitly everything that you need to depend on for the truth of your axioms and theorems and for the goodness of your inferences. So he said that then we need to make this as an explicit axiom. And this went largely unremarked, but Newell Belknap, when he started worrying about these things, I think his concern actually was, well, what are axioms? And he made fun of this Schröder axiom. He says, well, the first question we ask about axioms is, are they independent of one another? Is this axiom independent of the others? Are they independent of it? And the minute you ask that question, you see, well, if what's said in that axiom isn't true, then none of the other axioms say what he wants them to say. If you don't read them in that way, they're gibberish, or they say things that could mean all sorts of things. The stipulation he wanted to make is in order, but he seriously was misunderstanding the role of axioms in putting a condition on the meaningfulness of his notation in the form of an axiom. That has to go somewhere else. It's not quite a definition either. Well, it's the difficulty of knowing exactly where such a stipulation belongs is part of the issue that I want to talk about. So we could, in a meta-vocabulary, introduce notation that would let us make these things explicit. We could use angle brackets to talk about types. This is the type of A. And then we could use slash brackets, footnoted, as marking some particular tokening of this. This is the ith tokening of A in some thing. And then we could say, well, when we have P of A equals B, therefore P of B, well, we can say these two tokenings, 1 and 2, are both of the same type, and that's what's going to do the work for us. Well, what work exactly? This is the way we think of our notations as running, and it's marking out. I could say there is an equivalence class here. I could say these stand in an equivalence relation. That's the equivalence relation of being co-typical, being members of this same type. But now we can ask, sort of more abstractly, what work is that notion of co-typicality doing in defining substitution? Is there, for instance, in principle, any other way that it could be done? And it's striking that that relation between the tokenings is presupposed by substitution. Substitutional reason relations, as I say, implications and incompatibilities that have one premise and one conclusion, where one is a substitutional variant of the other. You can't make sense of that unless you can recognize across such statements repeatable expressions. So that notion of repeatability, of which this whole instance we have so far is co-typicality, that's presupposed by the notion of substitution, substitutional reason relations. And it's also stronger than co-reference. You can see that because co-reference is the relation those things stand into one another. The things that flank the identity sign, that identity sign says that those are co-referential. But you can't use that to say that those two, to say what the relationship is between those two things on pain of a regress. And as I say, if you think about what the identity of A equals A means, you see that that's a different kind of statement from A equals B. What is it? Co-reference you can make explicit in the object language using an identity statement. This repeatability, what I'll call token-recurrence, is a stronger relation than that. It's implicit in the way you use the notation, and as Schroeder's blunder shows, you have to be careful about how you make it explicit. I mean, I suggested we can introduce in a meta language notation to distinguish tokens and types, but we have to recognize that wavy equivalence there, I say the first tokening of A stands in this equivalence relation to the second tokening of A, that's stronger than co-reference, and if you make it explicit, you need to do that in some other way. I think our paradigm for thinking about these things comes from Russell, who talked about logically proper names. Logically proper names were ones that were where it was logically guaranteed that all the co-typical tokenings would be co-referential. And he thought in a perspicuous vocabulary that should be the case. And we could say, well, is it logical, or is it some grammatical or guaranteed notationally? But that adjective is meant to indicate the sense in which it's a stronger relation than co-reference, and presupposed by talking about co-reference of things. As I say, this seems to me a topic of evident philosophical significance, almost never explicitly talked about. Well, if we're going to think about the genus functionally defined of what co-typicality is doing for us in discerning substitutional relations among sentences, we need some alternative way that same job might be done. And we can tell that there is one and that there has to be one because there are expressions that are not logically proper names, and not just for the reasons that philosophers fussed about in the 70s and 80s in the wake of Kripke's naming a necessity. That is not just because, as a matter of fact, not all tokenings of the type Aristotle refer to the philosopher Aristotle. There's lots of people named Aristotle. So de facto, our proper names are not logically proper names. But that's not the issue. What Reichenbach called token-reflexive expressions are precisely those where the semantic value is attached to the particular token. Remember, last time I fussed and said, well, it really should be tokening, but I'm going to suppress that for today. Token-reflexive expressions like I and here, or this and that, where there is no presupposition that because you've used the same type on different occasions that they refer to the same thing. You pull two tokens of the term he out of some novel, no reason to believe that they refer to the same thing. So we can use those expressions. Those have conceptual content. They express conceptual content. That is, they play a semantically significant role in inferences. They make a contribution to the implications and incompatibilities of sentences they're involved in. So how does that work? Well, let's take the case of indexicals. Tokenings have indices associated with them, features of or properties of the tokening that can be specified in advance of your semantically interpreting them. Who's the speaker who uttered the tokening? Where was the tokening uttered? When was the tokening uttered? In what world was the tokening uttered? Lewis reminds us to think. And you compute the referent from the type and the index. So you know when the tokening of the type now was uttered, and that lets you compute what it refers to, the time that it refers to. Now it may sound overwrought to talk about computation in that case. It just is the index. But remember, our account of indexicals shouldn't just include things like I, where it's the speaker, but compound or complex indexicals, indirect indexicals, like my mother's favorite color. For that, you need to know who the speaker is to get them I, and compute the mother of the speaker, and then the favorite color of the mother of the speaker of the thing. So in that case, you can see there is a process marked by the other things that occur there. Well, that's how indexicals work and how their referents can be computed. And so we can imagine computing the referent, picking a logically proper name that was co-referential with that, and plugging that in for the expression that had occurred. Indexicals, we can see a way to incorporate them. Often, demonstratives are assimilated to indexicals. David Kaplan, who gave us our first adequate treatment of semantic treatment of indexicals, was most interested in extending that to demonstratives. That's a fundamental mistake. The line of thought was not silly. It was that the paradigm of demonstration is where I'm pointing, and the index is something like that gesture. That's what you're going to appeal to compute the referent. But it's not as simple as that, even if you have a pointing. Wittgenstein asks somewhere, are you pointing at the plate, or are you pointing at the color of the plate, or at the shape of the plate, or at the design on the plate? And he's concerned with, how do you know that you're right about that? What if you're really pointing? And then, of course, we miss a lot when we're pointing. You can't just follow out the line on my finger and see what it intersects with. wave my hands in the general direction of, the 19th century, say. But the main trouble with trying to treat demonstrations as an index is that you can't tell in advance of the task of computing the referent what the relevant index is. Indeed, there's almost no feature of the utterance that couldn't be the semantically salient feature of it, in virtue of which it demonstratively picks something out. We're familiar with a demonstrative that's interpretable only because we've restricted the domain of objects to ones that were mentioned earlier in the discussion, for instance. In fact, in semantically interpreting demonstratives, figuring out what, as it were, is playing the role of the index, the demonstration, what it is that's making this the referent rather than something else, computing the referent and figuring out what the relevant index is, those are just two ways of describing the same problem. Lewis says, this pig is grunting, can be paraphrased as the most salient pig is grunting. Well, what makes it the most salient pig? Well, that could be anything. We could be talking, there could be a pig in the room, but the most salient pig could be the one in the nursery rhyme that we're reading, for instance. Demonstratives should not be thought of as indexicals. But regardless of how we understand them semantically, there is a role that they're playing that's like the role played by indexicals. They're unrepeatable tokenings, which we can pick up using other expressions that are repeatable. And it's that initiation of an anaphoric chain. Anaphora is the relation between a pronoun and its antecedent. Well, that's the paradigm. That's the paradigm of it. You can start an anaphoric chain with an indexical or with a demonstrative. Either one of them, you have to have some way to turn that unrepeatable utterance. When I say, oh, look at that rabbit, it's just, oh, now it's gone. And you say, I don't think it ran like a rabbit. I think it might have been a cat. You use the pronoun in order to stipulate in a stronger than merely co-referential way that you're talking about the same thing I was talking about. You can't repeat my reference in the same demonstrative way. The rabbit's gone now, not point-attable anymore. But if you're going to make inferences about it, if you're going to object, so draw implications or point out incompatibilities, if that saying that rabbit is making a contribution to the conceptual content of the sentence that I'm making, to its inferential role, then there has to be such a thing as a conclusion drawn from it that's grammatically or logically guaranteed to be about the same thing, so that we can argue, about it. You have to be able to pick up that initial unrepeatable reference with a chain of pronouns that allow you to continue talking about the same thing. Charles Chastain wrote his Princeton dissertation later published in the Minnesota Studies in Philosophy of Science, on the notion of anaphora in natural language. And he pointed out that lack of attention to anaphoric chains had led people to misunderstand the use, for instance, of indefinite articles in natural language. That people think of them as existential quantifiers, when typically the function they're performing is being what he called anaphoric initiators, the things that start anaphoric chains, which, I mean, could be anything. So I could say, Leibniz was very disappointed that he wasn't invited to London when the court moved, Hanoverian court moved there. I've used he to pick up Leibniz, even though I could have said Leibniz again perfectly well. But in the case of indexicals and demonstratives, token reflexives generally, you can't. They merely initiate anaphoric chains, and if you want to continue them, you've got to use anaphoric dependence. You've got to use pronouns of some sort. Let me say parenthetically, I'm going to do all this in the category of singular terms. They're analogs for the other parts of speech, but while we're trying to drill down on it, I'll just talk about pronouns. So Chastain, for instance, considers the following sequence of utterances. Yesterday a Republican senator introduced this authoritarian bill. Someone else says, well, he's not going to get any support on the other side of the aisle. And then it turns out we get a report, the Republican senator later withdrew the bill. A Republican senator there is not just saying there is some senator. It's giving us an anaphoric initiator so that our pronouns can talk about that one, that Republican senator, the one who introduced the authoritarian bill. That's what the antecedent of he is. And the Republican senator later on, when we say the Republican senator later withdrew the bill, that's not the one and only Republican senator, and it's not even the one and only Republican senator contextually defined. No, that's an anaphorically dependent use of the Republican, of the phrase the Republican senator. It's explicitly marking its anaphoric dependence on the indefinite article, a Republican senator, by using the same phrase, Republican senator. The Republican senator, which one? The one that you were talking about when you said a Republican senator introduced this authoritarian bill. So I want to say that the general phenomenon that's going on here is a token-recurrence structure. And that can be marked, token recurrence can be marked by co-typicality, by the tokenings being of the same lexical type. But that isn't the only way that can happen. That co-typicality is a symmetric, transitive, reflexive relation. The types are equivalence classes of possible tokenings. But there's also anaphoric chains, which you can think of as reflexive if you like. They're transitive, but they're not symmetric. There's an asymmetry. You can be earlier or later in the anaphoric chain or in the tree that's whose root is some anaphoric initiator. And this relation between tokenings, as I've said before, it's stronger than co-reference. It's presupposed by, for instance, identities that we use to make co-reference explicit. And it's something we have to have if we're going to have unrepeatable tokenings. Put the indexicals to one side. I mean, we need it for the indexicals too. You say now, and I say then. And typically the then is anaphorically dependent on somebody's now. But it's clearest in the case of demonstratives that if the utterance of the demonstrative, that rabbit, is not just to be a noise, if it's to be semantically significant, that is to say, conceptually contentful, if it's to make a difference to the inferences that you can make, then there has to be some way to pick it up in the statement of a conclusion or of something that's incompatible with it. There has to be some way of taking up in repeatable form those unrepeatable utterances. Deixis, that is demonstratives, presuppose anaphora. It's unintelligible that there should be a language that had demonstratives in it, but did not have anaphoric pronouns that could pick up those unrepeatable utterances. And yet, if you look at the philosophical literature, there's a huge literature on demonstratives and virtually none on anaphora. And this in spite of the fact that Chomsky Mark III or thereabouts with his government binding framework made a generalized notion of anaphora absolutely central in thinking about grammar. Concerns at some remove from the ones I'm offering. Why so much talk about demonstratives in the philosophical literature? Because that's the point where the mind meets the world. That's the point where there's a causal contact between the things that I'm talking about and my talking about them. Rorty always suggested avoiding visual metaphors whenever you could, just because you would find things out by how difficult it was to do so. He would paraphrase this talk about demonstratives as where the rubber meets the road, where the mind meets the world, as saying that's where you rub the nose of the mind in the mess of the world. That's a characteristic expression. But if you think that, and so if you think that the paradigm of what are typically called de re beliefs, beliefs where the very object is the thing you need to consult for the semantics, that the locus and paradigm of de re beliefs, object-involving beliefs, is what's expressed by demonstratives, then you very much want to know how they work. Well, the way they work is by anaphora. That's what turns the non-conceptual occurrence, just as a response. There's an event out there, rabbit runs, and there's an event in here. I say, look at that rabbit. Causal connection between those. But what makes my response, look at that rabbit, conceptually and semantically contentful, is its inferential connections to other things, and that depends on your being able to take it up anaphorically. It depends on that unrepeatable tokening being able to play a role in token-recurrence structures. And for token-reflexive expressions, that's not possible. Sellers in EPM distinguishes between two kinds of epistemic authority, type authority and token authority, depending precisely whether the authority, am I saying snow is white? Well, whatever epistemic authority I have for that is invested in all the tokenings of that, all the tokens of that type. Whereas if I say, oh look, the stoplight's turned red, that authority depends on that particular tokening. So, yeah, Nikki.
I'm so sorry. This is not about the content. This is like wordy exegesis. Could you expand on why rubbing the nose
of the mind?
Yeah, I mean, less of a visual metaphor than where the rubber meets the road, because that to me seems to be about tactile things. And if the point is the nose smells, then both are equally picturesque.
Well, picturesque maybe, but yes, I mean, the thought is you're training your dog, right? No, not in the house. And so there is both the tactile and the olfactory part. That's sort of how the message is coming across. I mean, you would be punishing the dog if you rubbed his nose anywhere, right? But for him to know what the message is, it has to, So tactile and olfactory, and I think, he liked the less hygienic metaphors than the buttoned up than the buttoned up academics typically used.
His point was about sort of a philosophical fetish of vision as
absolutely.
The sense. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, in connection with Rorty, I will just, since we're off on this, I remember a discussion with him and Hlobil Grami, who had been to, for his early schooling, to what amounted to a colonial British school, where one read Macaulay to an extent that they don't even in England anymore, but it was left over from the British occupation. And Akil was saying, he absolutely could not stomach Macaulay. And Rorty said, well, yes, the politics, of course not. But when I read those long, periodic sentences, I feel like a chihuahua who goes into the study and sees that there in the middle of the beautiful oriental rug is a mess left by this gigantic Great Dane. And like that chihuahua, all I want to do is roll in those sentences, just with the thought that maybe when I leave the room, I will smell like that. So I wouldn't want you to think that Rorty's rhetoric was always excrementally addressed, but I am reminded of this other image. So, from the sublime to the ridiculous, or is it the other way? I was embarked on a sketch for a transcendental argument. It's got two premises, that's why it's a sketch. And the first is, you can't have an empirical language without demonstratives in it. Something has to play the role of unrepeatable responses to unrepeatable occurrences in the world if you're going to incorporate empirical content into a conceptual form. So to have an empirically contentful vocabulary, it has to include token reflexive expressions, particularly demonstrative expressions. And that means that any autonomous discursive practice must include demonstratives. Any language game you could play, though you played no other, is going to have to allow you to talk about what other people are saying, for instance, and just respond to other people. It's going to have empirical content. Deixis is as important as the philosophical tradition, recent philosophical tradition, has taken it to be, but it presupposes anaphora. You have got to have anaphoric token-recurrence structures in the language if you have demonstratives, if you have deictic expressions. Deixis presupposes anaphora. So any empirically contentful discourse or vocabulary has to include anaphoric token recurrence structures. These are non-symmetric asymmetric, really, in that there's an asymmetry between an anaphoric dependent and its antecedent, whether the antecedent is an initiator or not. Some expressions, as Chastain pointed out, are de jure initiators. Every time you use the expression a Republican senator, you're talking about a different one, or you might be. That is, if I say a Republican senator introduced this objectionable bill, later a Republican senator lobbied for it. If I wanted to grammatically guarantee that it was the same senator we were talking about, I would have said the senator lobbied for it. If I say A, I'm leaving open that I am starting a new anaphoric chain, and so the issue of whether there's an identity relation, a co-reference relation between them is left open. So there's some expressions that are always anaphoric initiators. There are others that are always anaphoric dependents, pronouns like he. You can see in the case of he that anaphoric pronouns can carry information about their antecedents. In gendered languages, they're telling you about the gender of the word rather than of the object, but various anaphoric dependents can carry different information about their antecedents. But we have to lay alongside the model of symmetric token recurrence as co-typicality in the model of logically proper names. We need to lay alongside that another kind of token recurrence structure that is asymmetric. I'll mention parenthetically, there is such a thing as backwards anaphora. There's a in the Jungle of the Beast, I'm not getting the title exactly right, there's a well-known Henry James short story that starts off, he never could understand such and such. He always thought this, and you actually go pages before you get an antecedent for the pronouns that you're working with. It's a tour de force that he did on purpose just to show it could be done if you were good enough. That doesn't affect the asymmetry that I'm talking about at all. It doesn't balance the asymmetry. But I was sketching a transcendental argument that any autonomous discursive practice, any vocabulary that can be deployed in an autonomous discursive practice must have this asymmetric token recurrence structure available in it. Well, if there's two of them, we could ask, are there maybe more kinds of token recurrence structure? I don't have an argument that there aren't, but all you need is, you need a non-symmetric one. It's certainly convenient to have the co-typicality one. Do you actually need the co-typicality one? Could you do just with anaphoric uses? Well, think about how identifying the token recurrence relation that's stronger than co-reference and needed for you to talk about co-reference there. Think about how hard that would be if we didn't have co-typical A's up there, even in the notation that I'm using for the types and for the tokens. Let me say a little bit more about the anaphora now as we think about these two token recurrence structures. Anaphoras, the principal locus of thinking about anaphora, and particularly in linguistics, is intrasentential anaphora. One of Chastain's innovations was taking the basic phenomenon to be interpersonal anaphora. And I'll say something in a minute about how propositional attitude descriptions let us turn interpersonal anaphoric connections into intrasentential anaphoric connections. That's where I want to go, how this can happen. Chastain does not, in this, I want to say 1966 article that was from his dissertation, he's not pursued the following point, which seems to me of the essence of the pragmatic function being performed by anaphora. And here by pragmatic, I mean the function that one needs to specify in a pragmatic metavocabulary, not something, oh, well, what's convenient about it. I'm not concerned about that. Consider the following dialogue. I walk up to the bus stop and come in the middle of a conversation, and all I hear is someone says, and at that point the guy totally lost it and took a swing at the cop. And I'm wanting to get in on the conversation, and I say, yeah, well, I bet he spent the night in jail then. Now I've used he, that pronoun, to pick up anaphorically his antecedent, the guy. I've stipulated, as it were grammatically, that I'm talking about the same one. He can't say in response to that, no, that was some other guy. No, we're talking about this guy. And the question is, did he, that guy, did he spend the night in jail? How is it that I can talk about this guy? I have no idea who he's talking about. That's the crucial function of anaphora interpersonally, is to let us talk without knowing what the hell we're talking about, to let us have a dispute. We can have an argument about whether this guy spent the night in jail. I could end up being convinced, but we can only have a dispute if we're talking about the same topic. And I can use this grammatical guarantee of co-reference. Co-reference you can argue about, but token-recurrence you can't, unless something, you have some defective speech. That is, there's this crucial epistemic function that's performed by anaphoric chains. And that is not to do with knowledge, but with ignorance. It's to make it possible for us to conduct rational discussions without having to track down all the way to the anaphoric initiator who it is we're talking about. So it might be possible to mount another sort of transcendental argument based on the necessity of people being able to have discussions without being required to trace everything back so they can say, yes, we know, yes, I know who you're talking about. I just don't need to do that in order to agree or disagree. Here's a second consideration, and this is where, so I have that sort of epistemic importance of ignorance, that we can keep the corrosive effects of epistemic ignorance out of our semantics, so whether you and I are talking about the same guy doesn't depend on what we know about him. He knew the guy was in a dispute with the cop. I only know that from him, but I can still talk about him, that very guy. The second point is a context in which some of these considerations have come up philosophically, even though not in the context of thinking about anaphora or token recurrence or whatever. And now I'm thinking about Kripke in Naming a Necessity, talking about how proper name usage works. I see his efforts in that essay as being a relatively rare example of asking how things that we say in a semantic metavocabulary are related to things that we say in a pragmatic metavocabulary. Because he wants to know what it is about our use of proper names, in virtue of which it's semantically proper to understand them as referring to this object or person. That's the endeavor that he's undertaking. And though he pitches this as, pitches his argument as a refutation of descriptivism about proper names, even before that, it starts with a criticism of treating proper names as logically proper names. It's not like that. We've got instead, he says, a structure where there's an initial baptism and then an inheritance of the reference from that baptism. This led people to attribute a causal theory of reference to him. He later said he was happier calling it a historical theory of reference. But the important point was that everybody else is downstream, is inheriting the reference from that initial baptism. Now, as you can imagine, the way I've set things up in telling the story here, it's pretty clear that he's talking about anaphoric initiators and things that function like pronouns. He's saying, when you look at the way proper names work, they're not Russellian logically proper names. That is, it's just not the case that there's a grammatical guarantee that all co-typical tokenings are co-referential. Well, but some of them are, so how do we determine this? And he says, well, think of them as having this asymmetric inheritance structure. There's an initiator, a baptism, and these other things we say, you've discovered anaphora in the heart of proper name usage. But wait a minute. He had an argument that this had to be the case, and the argument turned on the modal rigidity of proper names. That is, the way proper names behave in modal contexts, in subjunctive contexts. Now, our way of thinking about semantic content, our here, I mean Ulf and mine, but the one I've been expounding in these walls, is that the range of subjunctive robustness of reason relations is the core of their semantic, of the semantic content. And we've been looking at how that semantic content, that notion of a range of subjunctive robustness of implications and incompatibilities, how that can be transmitted down to singular terms and predicates and so on. Well, we're going to care then about the subjunctive robustness of substitution inferences and of occurrences of these expressions. Remember I said, starting from fairly fundamental grounds, that token recurrence is a stronger relation than co-reference. Well, it's stronger precisely in its behavior in these modal contexts. So, Kripke wants us to think about things like Benjamin Franklin is the inventor of bifocals, but Benjamin Franklin might not have been the inventor of bifocals. It's possible that Ben Franklin not have been the inventor of bifocals, but it's not possible that Ben Franklin not have been Ben Franklin. That's the modal rigidity of Ben Franklin. Well, it might not be the case that Ben Franklin were the inventor of bifocals, but he still would have been Ben Franklin. The he there refers to Ben Franklin, even in the counterfactual circumstances. It's stipulating the co-reference in a way that's stronger than mere co-reference. And that stronger then comes out, one of the manifestations of it is the way it behaves in modally robust contexts. This very bottle might not have been here for me to hold, but it still would have been a bottle. The it there, if I'd given it a name, it would be the same thing. Let's call this bottle Charlie. Charlie might not have been here for me to name, but it still would have been Charlie. It still would have been the same bottle. It still would have been that bottle. The it there is reaching inside the subjunctive context. So I understand modal rigidity as an anaphoric phenomenon. And though you can see the setting of Kripke's argument is very different, that's why he can argue from the modal rigidity, the behavior of proper names in modal contexts, that we have to think of the token-recurrence structure as being an anaphoric token-recurrence structure, not a Russellian logically proper name, where the grammatical guarantee is that all the co-typical tokenings will be co-referential. Well, Kripke draws strong metaphysical conclusions from the modal rigidity of proper names, ultimately about essences, about substances. There aren't any anaphoric chains out there in the world, in the world in the narrow sense, as Sellers says. We can describe this behavior of singular terms, the token-recurrence structure of anaphora. We can describe all of that in a pragmatic metavocabulary that lets us talk about what we're doing in using expressions. Wouldn't it be remarkable if from that description of the use of these expressions, one could legitimately draw strong metaphysical conclusions? Well, yes, it would be remarkable. In fact, I don't believe it. I think what's going on here is that, well, I want to think about it in terms of Hugh Price's distinction between object naturalism and subject naturalism. Now, the naturalism I'm going to divide through by in a minute, but his view is the object naturalist wants to know what is it you're talking about. I want to know about the semantic interpretants, and we're talking about terms, so the thing you're talking about, and I'm a naturalist, so I only understand the semantic reference that you can specify in a naturalistic vocabulary. So tell me, in a naturalistic vocabulary, say of fundamental physics or of the special sciences, different kinds of naturalism, go with that, but tell me, specify this referent, this thing you're talking about, in my favorite naturalistic vocabulary. And Price says, well, that's not the only way to be a naturalist. You can also be a naturalist if you can use a naturalistic vocabulary to describe what you're doing in engaging in these practices, in deploying this vocabulary. And Price usefully reads the later Wittgenstein as a subject naturalist. The object naturalist says, well, these numbers, I utter the number 4, the numeral 4. Now tell me about these numbers. They don't exert causal forces on things. How is it I know about these? In the language, in a naturalistic language, what are these numbers of which you speak? And Wittgenstein says, no, don't start there. If in a naturalistic vocabulary you can explain how it is that kids can learn to count, and on the basis of learning to count can learn to add, and so learn to use these numerals in a semantically significant way, well, we learned from Frege in the Grundlagen that what we mean when we say something is an object is that it can be picked out by a singular term. And so if you're puzzled about numbers, look to the use of numerals as singular terms. That's the lesson of the Grundlagen. And that's the lesson that Wittgenstein wants us to learn. There's nothing naturalistically objectionable about numbered talk. And if you have trouble picking out what's referred to by them in your naturalistic terms, so much the worse for your semantics that says that the way to understand this talk is to assign to each one something. You're taking something that's not mysterious by your own lights. You can describe the practice of using it in a naturalistic, pragmatic metavocabulary, and then you shouldn't be fussed that you don't know how to say the same thing in a representational semantic metavocabulary. Well, I said divide through by the naturalism. It's really the difference between what you can say in a pragmatic metavocabulary that talks about what you're doing and a semantic metavocabulary, which in the representational way is looking for a referent. Now, we actually have access to another kind of semantics, the implication space semantics. We're trying to drill down to talk about the singular terms here. So I suspect that Kripke's analysis of the modal rigidity of proper names, and they'll always say, and demonstratives are modally rigid as well, and give just the same examples where it absolutely is not the demonstrative that appears in the modal context. It's a pronoun, but that's unremarked. It says, no, it's not just proper names, but demonstratives also are modally rigid, and so pick out the same object in every possible world, and so we can have these. I think that's insisting on talking in a representational semantic metavocabulary, thinking that there must be some way of saying in that what we have no problem understanding in the pragmatic metavocabulary, in which we talk about the way these different expressions work. This is still not the terms, by and large, in which modal rigidity is discussed. But impressed by Kripke's achievement, we could say, well, there aren't really any logically proper names. Proper names are not that. Proper names are not such that all you need to know to determine the referent is what type the token is. No, they actually have this asymmetric token recurrence structure as well. That's the fundamental token recurrence structure, and we can project the ideal of a logically proper name from that. And one reason we can do that is that the first thing we do when faced with one of these anaphoric trees of chains is to find an equivalence relation from it. Because we say any two tokenings, even if they're not in the same anaphoric chain, If they're in the same anaphoric tree, then they're grammatically guaranteed to co-refer in this stronger than mere co-reference way to be token recurrences. That's the relation we care about. It's got more structure than just the equivalence relation because it's abstracted from this anaphoric inheritance structure. The language has to have structures like that, and it doesn't have to have anything else. It doesn't have to have structures that work by co-typicality, except, we are finite creatures, and it's easy for us to have clusters, the Aristotle-Onassis cluster that we'll keep separate from the Aristotle-Nicomachean structure, and then there's others where we don't know whether the Paderewski, the pianist, is part of the same anaphoric tree as our Paderewski, the Polish statesman, anaphoric trees are. They turn out to be, but you could easily think they were different. That is, there's a good heuristic reason for us to have large stretches of the language where the anaphoric token recurrence structure is codified in or marked by co-typicality. That's a sensible thing. But if I'm writing a computer language, say, I may be perfectly happy to have each tokening individually identified and to keep track of the actual structures among them with co-typicality neither here nor there. And that's a good thing if there aren't actually parts of the sentences that correspond to these expressions. That is, if we're already looking at the relations among many sentences in order to see the feature that is the occurrence of this, now we'd like to say, either anaphorically initiating demonstrative or anaphorically dependent other expression. Okay, so I think there's a big topic here that philosophers of language should be worrying about more than they have. It's been a very minority interest. It was so idiosyncratic that in the years after making it explicit, right, make an argument like this, there was a brief flurry of jokes about the way different philosophers died. And one of the Brandom one was Bob Brandom died strangled by an anaphoric chain. It was seen as such an idiosyncratic, yes, anaphora, that would be the only one you'd be talking about. Here's a question that would only come up in the context of the sort of enterprise I've been expounding. We know how to make reason relations logically explicit. Conditionals can be introduced into an extension of the object language in order to make implications explicit, and negation can be introduced together with the conditionals to make incompatibility explicit. We know less well, but in general, we know how to make the contribution that singular terms and complex predicates make to the reason relations of the sentences in which they occur explicit. We introduce explicit identity locutions to license the symmetric intersubstitution that co-referential terms have. And we introduce quantified conditionals, universally quantified conditionals, everything that walks moves, in order to codify that P of A, therefore Q of A pattern. So the P of A, therefore P of B, that gets licensed by A equals B, and the other one by the quantified conditional. Okay, I say we don't know how to do that as well. We, Ulf and I, don't, in the book, drill down to that level, and I haven't offered and could not right now, a sequent calculus that would tell how to introduce those, but we can sort of see how that goes. Anyway, we know what the logical locutions that make that explicit would be. I remember last time I was talking about, well, maybe I wasn't. In making it explicit, there's 3 semantic levels: the level of sentences, inferences, the level of subsentential expression, substitution, and the level of anaphora, ISA, are the three levels. Well, we can introduce logical expressions to make explicit what's going on at those first 2 levels. What would a logical expression look like that you introduce to make anaphoric relations explicit? What would that look like? I mean, we can do it in a meta vocabulary. That's what I did on the board. You have an expression that refers to types, an expression that lets you refer to individual tokens of them, and then you can talk about the relations between the tokenings and the types. You could put a greater than sign in that means is anaphorically dependent on for the tokenings, but that's not what we're asking for. If we're asking for a logical locution, that's to be introduced into an extension of the object language, not into a meta vocabulary. How could one tokening explicitly acknowledge its anaphoric dependence on another? Now, in an early essay called Reference Explained Away, I consider functionally, sort of from above, how would it have to work? And it seemed to me there's 2 features of it. It's got to have some way of picking out the antecedent, because it's supposed to explicitly say, I'm anaphorically dependent on this antecedent. And then it's got to have the part where it says, I'm anaphorically dependent on this thing. So we can imagine the locution is T of, and then some tokening specification. Well, the transitivity of anaphoric dependence means that if you repeat that, T of this tokening, that's got to be co-referential with the original tokening as well. And that turns out to be a very strong formal constraint on such a logical locution. But here's the thought, and this was the core of that essay. Suppose the speaker says, don't rely on Binkley as an auto mechanic. That airhead misadjusted the valves on my car. That's the original statement. And now we have somebody, our attributor, who says, I disagree. The one S referred to as an airhead is actually a pretty good mechanic. Now, I think the expression, the one S referred to as that airhead, is a pronoun. It's anaphorically dependent on the original expression, that airhead, which with the demonstrative is unrepeatable as such. Other expressions of other tokenings of the type that airhead would not be guaranteed to co-refer. But the one S referred to as that airhead, when I use that expression, I'm guaranteed to be picking up the reference. I might not know Binkley. I might not, in making this later response, I might not have heard the first sentence, don't rely on Binkley as an auto mechanic. I may have come into the conversation with the second one, that airhead misadjusted the valves on my car. Now, if I'm in that position, I'm in no position to disagree with him, but I could have said, well, where does he work? Or, or even, is that Binkley? Using an explicit using an ordinary pronoun for that, the one S referred to as that airhead, the one S described as an airhead, the one S called an airhead, those are all semantic locutions, reference, description, what was described as, what is referred to as, what he calls such and such. And my claim in that essay, Reference Explained Away, is that's the fundamental use of refers. It's a pronoun forming operator. It lets you form an expression that anaphorically picks up the thing whose referent you're talking about. If that's an anaphoric initiator, you've just got a pronoun on it, and so you're talking about that thing. If it itself is an anaphoric dependent, well then trust the chain to take you back to the initiator of it. And notice you could come in later and talk about the one Bob referred to as the one S referred to as that airhead. And you're still sliding down that anaphoric chute to the same referent, in that you're getting connected to a tokening there. So refers, forming the one referred to by, and then a specification of the tokening, which could be a definite description. I call these anaphorically indirect definite descriptions. The one X referred to by this tokening that he uttered. That's a definite description of the tokening that anaphorically gets me to the object. So it's a description of the, but it's what's described is the tokening that I'm anaphorically hitchhiking with, rather than the object that I'm referring to. But my claim is that's the sort of expression that would count as playing the expressive role, the logical expressive role of making explicit these token recurrence dependencies. What one is doing in using refers is forming anaphoric pronouns. I put it that way to emphasize that that's a remark in a pragmatic metavocabulary. That's what you're doing. What is the reference relation? Maybe there is one, maybe there's not. That's asking the object naturalist the semantic question. What does the term refer to? And you may remember Putnam gets mileage out of the fact that that question turns back on itself, so that different notions of reference could have different stories about what refers to. Well, here I'm not pretending to answer that question. I'm answering the question, what are you doing when you use the word refers? And I'm saying all the legitimate uses of that term can be paraphrased, regimented into uses of formation of pronouns that are anaphorically dependent on the expression whose referent you're specifying. Now, one of the overarching lessons I've been urging from the beginning of the course is that we know hardly anything about the relations between what you can say in an expressively powerful pragmatic metavocabulary and what you can say in various kinds of semantic metavocabulary, paradigmatically the representational semantic metavocabularies. But every once in a while we can say something, and Well, now it might look as though we have an embarrassment of riches, because I've talked about refers before. I said refers is the locution that we use in natural languages to form de re ascriptions of propositional attitude. That is, it's to say, refers, okay, that's not in the natural language. We pick out the of and the about of intentional directedness or reference by saying, Henry Adams believed of the inventor of the lightning rod that he did not invent the lightning rod. I said that use of distinguished from the sense of in the pen of my aunt, which is not that referential one, or he was talking about numbers, the number about which he claimed that. Those I said, which we might regiment using a refers locution. That I said was the expressions to look at the use of in order to understand the use of the expressions by which we attribute referential connections, semantic, representational connections. What I want to say now is, yes, and that is the anaphoric use. And here, if you remember, when I was talking about the de re ascriptions, I mentioned that the inverse of them is scare quotes. But imagine in that same sort of dialogue, someone says, the brave freedom fighters liberated the village. And I say, the ones of which you speak slaughtered every human being in the village. I can do that interpersonally. I can say, with just a pronoun, I could say, liberated the village. They slaughtered all the humans in it. My they picks that up. That interpersonal anaphora gets into the ascription when I'm ascribing what you believe. It now becomes the ascription structural anaphora that connects some expression in the de re portion with an anaphoric pronoun in the de dicto portion. So, I can report your utterance. He claimed of a bunch of bloodthirsty murderers that they liberated the village. That's the packing into intrasentential ascription structural anaphora, what starts off as interpersonal anaphora. My being able to pick up and stipulate that I'm co-referring with you without wanting to endorse the way you referred to them. That's what we do in the de re ascriptions. That's what's made explicit in a different way in the scare quotes. So in fact, this is the same phenomenon that I'm pointing to as what you're doing when you use representational, referential, semantic locutions is to be understood anaphorically. And indeed, we can see those locutions as performing our paradigmatic logical expressive task of making explicit the contribution to reason relations that some expression makes. So we can do that at all three levels. It's just the third level brings us, when we drill down below singular terms and predicates to token-recurrence structures, that's where we get to these modally rigid representational relations. Well, that's the way they're thought of. from the pragmatic point of view, they're just token-recurrence structures. And the move to project them into your metaphysics requires at least a lot of stage setting to bring off. Okay. Well, that's the end of my substantive story. Why don't we take our 15-minute break? It's 2:31. Let's come back at 2:46. Okay. Well, I felt like I should close by saying something at least about where we've been on this way. And the course really fell into two parts. The first part being my recounting of the story of the book with Ulf. Told it, bits of it in different ways, but it is essentially that story. And I've put on the handout Ulf's diagram for what we did there. Our agreed upon summary is chapter 6, the conclusion of it. We said there, to my satisfaction, how things go. You've seen me talk about these a bit before. Ulf is more sensitive to the difference between logic and the other three metavocabularies. And that's what the bit on the far right is. He wants to say both the meta-languages above the dotted line and the logical vocabulary below play the function of making explicit reason relations. But he wants that line with the logical vocabulary on the other side of it, because logic is not really a meta-vocabulary. It's essential to it that it be introduced as an extension of the object language in a way that is not true of other meta-vocabularies. I tend to tell a story where there is a genuine meta-vocabulary, and that's the meta-vocabulary of the sequent calculus, which is the fourth of these, which we use to introduce logical vocabulary to define the extension of the base vocabulary, the non-logical vocabulary. So that's, a difference of emphasis. But we have on the left the normative pragmatics. That was our topic in week 3, giving a more elaborate normative pragmatic story than is normally told. I tell one such story in the first chapters of Making It Explicit, culminating in chapter 3. Usually we don't get an expressively powerful pragmatic meta-vocabulary sort of for the whole of discourse. That doesn't seem to be a thing philosophers of language much do. But if you do that in the right way, taking the cue from Restall and Ripley's bilateral understanding of implication in the sequent calculus, but adding to that a picture of discourse as essentially and not just accidentally giving and asking for reasons, making claims as essentially and not just accidentally being part of a package that includes rationally challenging those claims by giving reasons against them, and rationally defending them, justifying them by giving reasons for them, having that pragmatic picture, making the distinction between inference and implication that Harman suggests and that McFarlane enforces, and bringing on board the rest-all bilateralism, we get still very simple but complicated enough, expressively powerful enough pragmatic metavocabulary that, as Ulf realized, we can set up the isomorphism with the truth-maker representational semantic theory. So that's the relation horizontally between these two extrinsic explanatory metavocabularies. We call them extrinsic because they both appeal to things that are not in the non-logical vocabulary. On the pragmatic side, we're appealing to commitments and entitlements. On the semantic side, we're appealing to fusion and impossibility of states. And in each case, the attempt is not just to specify reason relations, but to say what they are and why they are the way they are. So in the semantic one, it's because these propositions are related as they are that this implication is a good one. And on the normative pragmatic side, we say, well, it's because we're taking or treating anybody who's committed to this to be committed to this other thing. We tell a story about what the reason relations are in terms of the practices of acknowledging them as normatively governing the giving and asking for reasons. And then we have the other dimension, the vertical dimension, a version of Dan Kaplan's implication space semantics at the top. With it, able to interpret both the normative pragmatic metavocabulary and the truth maker theory, and also being sound and complete for our logic. But, and this is also something I take maybe more seriously than Ulf does, but it's still up in the air. It's not just a soundness and completeness result. It's much more general than that. And I emphasized this, I think, in week 7 when we talked about the implication space semantics. Ulf noticed, and I think in this way he went beyond what Dan had seen. Ulf was able to set up a correspondence between features of connective definitions formulated in the sequent calculus on the one hand, and operations of adjunction and simjunction in the semantics. Maybe you remember, maybe I should have reproduced it on the handout here, but depending on whether you have a one-sequent or a two-sequent rule, the semantic rule has different features. The thing that appears as the conclusion in a premise sequent shows up in a particular way in the rules. The simjunction and adjunction correspond to different features of your rules. So in effect, we have a way of taking a specification of any logic in the sequent calculus and giving a sound and complete implication space semantics for it. So it's not just one result. Oh, you can do that for this logic and MMS our favorite. We can do it for anything you can formulate in the sequent calculus. So that's the relation that I see as parallel to the Hlobil isomorphism that's horizontal, is that demonstration that the implication space semantics really is something like the native semantics of the sequent calculus, so any logic you can specify in the sequent calculus, this is how you can interpret it semantically. There are corresponding results. Well, Kripke's results about for modal logic are like that. He didn't just show a sound and complete semantics for S5, say. He gave us a procedure for doing that for any modal logic. Anyway, for a whole class of modal logics. The implication space metavocabulary and the sequent calculus metavocabulary, like the logical vocabulary we introduce with the sequent calculus one, are intrinsic metavocabularies in that all we need to do is start with the non-logical vocabulary. You appeal to nothing except the lexicon and the reason relations. That's our definition of a vocabulary. So these are all rational metavocabularies in that they are articulating, making explicit the reason relations of arbitrary non-logical vocabularies. Arbitrary meaning including the ones that have substructural reason relations. That's a sort of overarching constraint that I think it's fair to say we do a better job satisfying than anybody else does. Looking at the substructural things, the Hlobil isomorphism between the right kind of normative pragmatics and the right kind of semantics is at the level of reason relations rather than at the level of sentences and truth conditions or at the level of subsentential expressions. It has consequences for relations at those lower levels, but the fundamental one is at the level of reason relations. And that's a different way of thinking about the representational dimension of discourse, if by that you mean the relation between what you say in pragmatic metavocabularies and what you say in semantic metavocabularies. And that gives us a robust grip on the notion of reason relations, which is not something, the way we've drawn the boundary around it, not something that's a big philosophical topic, but it's what's common to what you can specify in a normative pragmatic metavocabulary, a truth maker representational semantic metavocabulary, an implication space metavocabulary, and sequent calculi. Those are the reason relations, and we show how the same things can look from those different points of view. That notion of logical vocabulary is extended beyond the way people normally think about it. It's clear that modal vocabulary is logical vocabulary in this sense, but other things as well. We can introduce the modal box basically is a monotonicity marking box. That's the way we're going to understand modality in terms of subjunctive robustness, but we can also mark regions of classicality in substructural settings also, and that's logical. And I was just talking how as we delve below the level of sentences, it's possible still to use this expressive approach to logic to get other logical expressions besides the ones that are involved with sentences. Anyway, this is another telling of the story we tell in the book. The second bit of the course, a little bit shorter, well, don't have as clean a story here, is first of all looking at other features of the use of language that are not captured in the stripped down version that is at the right level of description for the Hlobil isomorphism to come into play. The social dimension, the difference between, that's essential to the notion of commitment, the difference between attributing a commitment to somebody else and undertaking it or acknowledging it yourself. But we saw, once again, that we could understand propositional attitude ascribing locutions as making explicit pragmatic features of discourse, and so distinguish de dicto and de re ascriptions of propositional attitude, which turn precisely on the difference between commitments that are attributed and those that are acknowledged. Also looked at the historical dimension in order to understand the sense in which reason relations are determinate, or have determinate content conferred on them by being used in the ways our pragmatic metavocabulary specifies. We need to look at the diachronic development of them. And here I claim that the story I extract from, foist on Hegel, recollective rationality, anyway, seems to be what we need. Third thing we looked at is the empirical dimension of language use. The non-inferential observation reports and how those unrepeatable events can get taken up and have inferential significance and therefore conceptual content. There, I suggested thinking in terms of normative governance of representings by representeds and subjunctive tracking of representeds by representings as things we could make sense of in a suitably expanded, expressively expanded, pragmatic metavocabulary. So all of those I think of as further fillings in of the pragmatic metavocabulary that we start with. And then the last three times, we look at singular terms and predicates, that is, delve for the first time below the level of sentence usage. And that's the story that culminates in the story I told today. So we look, if we help ourselves to a notion of substitution and substitution variant, what's the difference between terms and predicates and why are there any? We can tell a compelling story there, I think. Second, well, what if we don't have substitutional relations given? What if there aren't subsentential expressions? Can we functionally characterize substitutional relations just given the reason relations? And here, if you think about how spare our notion of a vocabulary is, it's just a set of sentences and a set of reason relations, which is a set of pairs of sets of sentences. It was a job of work to get down to assign semantic roles to single sentences. Right? What we're first interpreting is candidate implications, interpreting them by their ranges of subjunctive robustness. Well, it takes a job of work to drill in and associate a content with a sentence. We say, well, that's the pair of its premissory role and its conclusory role, and we could say what those were, but those were already pretty complicated things, the actual roles of sentences. It's the range of subjunctive robustness of the pair A and the empty set, and the range of subjunctive robustness of the pair empty set A. That's what the semantic value, the conceptual content of A is. And now we propose, still starting just from the reason relations up here, to assign conceptual contents to singular terms and predicates that appear in those sentences. So it's not surprising that it's mathematically a bit challenging to see the relations things are standing in conferring this content, but we did. We saw really just this time how to descend not only from the level of reason relations governing sentences to the level of semantically significant subsentential expressions, singular terms and predicates, but all the way to token-recurrence structures and anaphora. And one thought I wanted to express at this point is those 3 points of view on subsentential structure correspond, I want to say, exactly to the 3 dimensions that Kant runs together in the intuition concept distinction. Now, I say runs together. He did it on purpose. That is, that was his view, not just a confusion. On the other hand, he also did not clearly separate these dimensions, and I think we've discovered that they're all orthogonal. Now, some real Kantians would object to that. But as I read Kant, the concept-intuition distinction includes the distinction between the general and the particular. This is official, that concepts are general representations and intuitions are particular representations. Now, Kant, who is extremely explicit and clear about how important it is to distinguish relations between representations on the one hand and representations of relations on the other hand, a serious discussion of that in the first critique, is completely uncritical, if I could say that, about the corresponding distinction between particular representations and representations of particularity, because he thinks of intuitions as both, and doesn't think that you could have representations of particulars that were not themselves particular, or particular representations that were representations of generals. This seems to be something that simply did not occur to him. So he also lines up the concept-intuition distinction with the distinction between repeatables and unrepeatables. So intuitions are, demonstrative-like, and he is concerned that they need to be taken up into some kind of conceptual, repeatable structure, and he's worried about how that can happen, how that unrepeatability can be given repeatable content. Furthermore, he associates the distinction between concepts and intuitions with the distinction between cognitive activity and passivity. The intuitions are the ones we find ourselves with, so non-inferentially acquired, commitments or components of commitments, as opposed to the ones where we're thinking, reasoning, conceiving, understanding. That's all conceptual for him. So we distinguished these different distinctions, and one really ought to, because you can have, I can notice not just Fido the dog, but I can notice that he's a dog. I can notice the color non-inferentially. That what's non-inferentially available can be either represented by a singular term or by a concept, and so on. These distinctions really are orthogonal. You can have, unrepeatable applications of concepts, and so on. So that's what we did sort of in the course. I want to close with an observation and a question. And the observation is, we've got these three levels. In making it explicit, it's inference, substitution, and anaphora as the three levels of semantics. But we've got reason relations, and we've got the substitutional roles that things can play, and we've got token-recurrence structures to get down to the level of unrepeatable events in unrepeatable speech acts. The reason relations come in two flavors: implication and incompatibility. Implication's non-symmetric. Incompatibility, we saw, has to be symmetric. Substitution inferential roles. Well, the substitution inferential significance of a singular term is symmetric. It's intersubstitutable with co-referential singular terms, whereas the substitution inferential significance of predicates is non-symmetric. Can be symmetric, but is typically asymmetric. We've got a symmetric kind, terms, conceptual content, and an asymmetric one, predicates. And now when we come down even further, drill down even further to the token-recurrence structures, there's the symmetric ones, co-typicality, the logically proper names, the ones we sort of start this arc with, that you think of everything as being like that. By the end of the, in the middle of the arc, we discover, no, there's another way for token reflexives. By the time we've learned our redescription of Kripke's lesson, no, it turns out it's all the new kind. It's all asymmetric, anaphoric token recurrence structures. That is, we've got a symmetric kind of token recurrence structure and an asymmetric kind of token recurrence structure. Why? Why at all three of these levels does our first analysis yield, well, you've got to have two components, one of which works symmetrically and the other of which is asymmetric? Is that something about discourse, about language? That's our topic, and for some reason, this very fundamental structural distinction is going to show up at every level of it. Are we learning something about talking and thinking by seeing that? Gee, that would be nice. I just don't know what it is that we'd be learning from that. That's the question. Or is this not really interesting at all because we're not applying a very large armamentarium of formal methods here. We're using really pretty simple mathematical metavocabularies for talking about these. Is this just an example of only having a hammer so the whole world looks like a nail, because of our sort of mathematical impoverished vocabulary that we're using? Or is it only psychological? In the end, this is all downstream from ways I've come across thinking about things, and this could be a reflection of sort of how I think about things rather than how they are. Or is it really trivial because it's just a coincidence? I mean, the relation between symmetric incompatibility and asymmetric implication doesn't really line up with terms and predicates. It's not as though the terms are particularly significant for incompatibilities rather than implications in their symmetry, or that the predicates do line up with the implication, but they're equally important. I mean, the predicates are the bearers of the reason relations, and the singular terms are really just the units of account for them. So both kinds of reason relation really map on to the predicates, but you do need a unit of account, and it has to be symmetrically significant both with respect to implications and incompatibilities. And then when we come down to the token recurrence structures, really we're at some remove from the reason relations at this point. We're just trying to get these things assembled into structures that can be units of account for substitutions. Maybe these are really quite disparate distinctions, and it's just a brute coincidence that there's those distinctions have a symmetric component and an asymmetric component. At this point, I don't know what to say. It'd be quite a coincidence if that's what it is. At any rate, having taken you on this voyage through the three levels, so you've sort of seen the emergence of the symmetric and asymmetric components at each time. I was not purposely putting the rabbit into the hat, but it doesn't mean I didn't let him in, unawares. But having taken you through that, I wanted to leave you with this question. Nobody else is going to worry about it. Most of the other philosophers don't care about any of these three distinctions. This is intramural, but you're among the few human beings who are in a position to ask this question, never mind address it. So anyway, that's the observation and the question that I leave you with. It's a sort of striking thing about the edifice that we've been rehearsing here, and I don't know what to make of it. And that's, I hope that's a good place to be for a philosopher. But, at any rate, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.